ones in the office right now,
And
just because we bathe in hand sanitizer when we come in.
that's right.
We stay at least 40 feet away and yell at each other across the office, so it's been pretty safe.
Did you bring your measuring tape? I know you've had that in some other
Yeah,
meetings.
I do have my measuring tape
Yeah.
too. I didn't bring it with me. We're about 1 meter away right now, which I think translates to 18 feet or something like that.
So
But
we're good.
I think we're okay. So yeah, so we've got this show today.
Yep.
We're doing. It's Friday, end of the week. Hopefully into next week, and everybody's back and excited to make things happen. And we've been doing this show, Spin Out, to talk about how service companies can create their own product to find scale. Because sometimes when you're in a service business, it's hard to drive scale because your revenue and your expenses run in parallel a lot of times, because it takes money and effort and resources to produce a solution. Whereas with a scalable product, one of the opportunities is that you can scale your revenue at a little bit of a greater rate than your expenses, and really create something that's profitable. And so we've been talking in this series all about how do you create a spin-out product within a business.
Yeah, I think it's timely too with everything going on in the world.
Right.
I think most service businesses wish they had something scalable. They wish they had something where there weren't the geographical limitations that you might have with typical service businesses. So I think this is a fun topic to dive into. And this week I think is an exciting one. We're talking building, right? So last week we talked about like the operational and legal side of things, important considerations. That was kind of that pause.
Right.
This one we're kind of diving into how do you hit the ground and start building, right?
Yeah, we've gone through the whole process, talked about how do you find product ideas, how do you vet them, how do you understand the market opportunity. We talked through, how you plan features out. And like you said, last week we got into the legal stuff, and this week into the building. And this is a fun part, this is where most people want to go. But I think to that point this is almost towards the end of our series, and there was a lot of steps previous to this that are so important. Whereas I know a lot of founders, they're so excited they want to skip all that stuff of figuring out what's the business model, all of these things, and they want to drive right into the building so they can have something tangible to put out to the marketplace. But hopefully everybody goes back, watches all of those previous episodes, and thinks about the strategic things that you need as a foundation to this building piece.
Yeah, you got to build off of a strong foundation
right
to that point. So that's where we're at now.
So we're talking about a couple things. We have this where it's really, some primary considerations that you have. And really, for us, it's like development and business. Within development, you've got strategy, user interface and user experience, the development and deployment, which gets into the fact of what we'll talk about at the end of this, is agile development, where you're constantly putting out new versions, and then testing and quality assurance, which I think one thing that a lot of product builders don't realize is that there needs to be a lot of quality assurance and testing in this, because the last thing you want to do is put out a version that doesn't function, causes an error because it can turn visitors away. And we're doing that whole other series on retention, and one of those things is if you start pushing out bugs, you're going to lose users, which is not a good thing for any software business.
For sure.
And then we've got the business stuff.
Yeah, so we have obviously marketing and sales is a big piece. How do you take this concept and put it in package that message nicely, get people excited, compel them to want to try it, give it a try and purchase. And then we have accounting and legal, and we talked a little bit about those elements in our last show. So if you want to go back to those considerations, but always important, right? So for me, probably for you, this is never the fun stuff, but it's critical. It's crucial stuff to
100%.
your success of your business. Support, I think support kind of permeates into other areas as well, but you can always, part of the agile model is that you're going to get that feedback, right? You need that powerful feedback loop. So support is really important, keeping the experience positive for the users and whatnot. And then hosting and infrastructure. So just as testing, QA, all that's important, right? We need to keep it up, running, in good shape to keep happy users, everything kind of bleeds together, but you need to segment it out and look at it from those perspectives.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you're spinning out a product and you're talking about this internally. Are you really looking at all these areas, and are you building a plan that's going to be successful? Because we've even seen it. We work with a lot of service companies that are spinning out their own products, and some of them are even unaware of issues like hosting and infrastructure. How do I handle, scalable growth and make sure that as I add users, my system can scale with that, or even support that. A lot of times I think people just, they don't realize the army of people behind most products that are handling support and helping, making sure that users are happy and staying in the software. So there's some important things here that you really need to be thinking about.
For sure.
The other piece is really then looking at team and resources. So what we're typically talking about is what's the team that you need to do all of that. So if we have all those different elements and we're truly thinking of it, what roles do we need?
Yeah.
Do we need people in strategy that are really thinking about, what's the vision for this and what's the roadmap, and what are the partnerships that we're going to need, the marketing and sales of it, all that stuff to really get growth. The product side of it, which is product management, really planning out the features and how it needs to integrate and that infrastructure and all of that. And then obviously design and development, and then even into support and all of these other roles that are just so important. And then what we really have to decide is where those resources are going to come from. Are they something that we're hiring internally, or using existing people within our business if we're spinning out? Are we hiring freelancers, consultants on the strategy side? Are we hiring an agency or a development firm to do marketing or product development? What's the right mix? And especially if you're gonna spin this out of an existing business, do you have any of those people in-house? Do you really want to fully leverage them? One of the things that I've seen with companies that try and do spin-outs is that, and we've actually seen this with a couple clients, is that they try and do a lot of it in-house for a little while, but then those people only have varying focus on it.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is 3 years later, they're still talking about the product. They're only 30% of the way through, and they really haven't gotten anywhere. And so it's really about that process of, then questioning, do we need to bring somebody else in if we're serious about this? Which gets back to the past episode about capital and where are we funding this from?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of considerations. Obviously, you want to pull on, especially early on, as much from your internal resources as you can, but at the same time, you got to balance that with keeping your existing business running. So that's could be a roadblock. A lot of times, people will jump to freelancers. In certain cases, there's great talent out there. It's just at what stage, how big this project becomes. Do you want to rely on maybe just a solo contract type individual, as opposed to moving on to a consultant who brings knowledge, but they're not necessarily hands-on developing? Agency, there will be solutions out there that are bigger, broader, could do more. I think the important piece is fit and the idea of partnership and looking at, finding the partners you bring on that you work well with and really understand one another.
Yeah, I think it's strengths and weaknesses. You really look at what strengths do you have and what gaps do you need to fill, and what is the best approach to doing that. And sometimes there's different plays. We're right now here with us doing that team canvas, where it's an exercise where you're looking at things like strengths and weaknesses, promises, rules and activities, and you're really kind of planning out your team canvas. It's almost something that you need to do here even early on in developing a product, to think about what are the strengths and weaknesses, who are the people that we need, what are their responsibilities or partners, and put that all on paper so that you have a plan.
And I think in this case, if you're running a service business and this is a concept to you, you've never done anything with software before, sometimes it's just having clarity on what those skills that are needed, what are they, and kind of what are your options for all that. So I think it's important to step back and do some planning, do some research, and understand options available, and then making a smart decision.
Yeah. Well, and we've even seen with some of our clients that they have partners for an initial stage because they can get help like a freelancer. You know, and it gets them so far maybe to an MVP, but they realize when they really want to take this to the next level, look at investor funding, really scale it, whether the complexity of the technology, that then they have to bring in somebody else. So there's also stages to this. And we talked about that with a couple clients, is really the support piece, is that, you know, can you outsource that until at some point you can bring it in? And same thing with sales, marketing. I mean, these are all considerations of, you know, multiple phases and what's right for you at the time that you're in. And especially if you've got that existing business, how do you really, you know, make all that match? So next was really talking about two things, the old platform versus the new platform. So this is something that we've used with especially service companies that we're working with to kind of explain the model of development and how we think of it. Because one of the things when you're getting into building is figuring out, how are we going to build this? What is the technology? What is the stack, basically? So what coding languages or frameworks or other systems are you going to use? So the old platform model was very like, if you remember the days, a database, you know, you have a ton of files doing processing. So let's say it's a PHP system and you're processing a bunch of data and it's creating pages and sending them off to the browser to display and interact with the user, and then every time somebody clicks on something, it's coming back, processing and going. You know, and so that's kind of the old model. The new model today that we really try and look at is that the interactive piece and the display. The interactive is the biggest. So if you go back to this, you've kind of got this interact is equal to display over here, and they're the same size, but now we're really talking about interactive becomes the biggest piece of this puzzle. The processing is a little smaller and the data stays about the same. And so what we're really looking at is that you see these platforms that when you interact with them, they're changing real time. You know, they're filtering data. They're not reloading a page, going back to a server and learning. They are doing a little bit of that behind the scenes, you know, which is something called Ajax, where it can go back and forth and bring bite-sized pieces of data so that the page can update real time. But that's the model that we're moving to because people really want to leverage that front end, and there's a lot of benefits that we'll actually talk about next in these different models.
I really like how you break that down because it makes a lot of sense. Do you have like an example of, you know, something that I think people can really make sense of? Because to that point, even just, you know, websites, there's so much now that you can do when you go to a site, you have an interaction, you have real-time processing, you know, right on the front end. It's that interactive.
And they even call them one-page apps now, where, you know, in the old days, again, every time that someone had an interaction, it usually was going back to the server, processing and building, and then sending everything back. So these huge payloads. And probably shipping is the best way to think of it is, you know, if you're building a house, it's saying like every time you build a house, you have to go get every piece of material, bring all of it back, versus maybe a system where, you know, you're going out and get the framing, and then while someone's doing the framing, someone else is going out and getting this, you know, and then we decide to make another change, and it's very, you know, real time, and you're just getting the pieces that you need rather than, you know, these big payloads. And so really it's this model where, you know, they talk about one-page app where instead of it going back to the server multiple times, once you load it, it's just then doing little loads, and you're never really reloading the whole thing. And the nice thing about that is for users, the speed piece, especially when a lot of people are mobile, is that you're loading a lot of the big stuff first. So that first load is a little bit bigger, and then after that it's a lot of small stuff. And you think of Gmail, you know, you don't reload Gmail. What happens is behind the scenes, it just every minute goes and checks to see if there's a new email, and then it just brings that new email in. You know, and so as you're interacting with this app, it's only getting the information it needs, but you rarely have to reload the whole page.
Because that takes a while. We're so used to that instantaneous, you know, when it times out sometimes and it's got to reconnect.
You notice Gmail has that like loader bar because there's a lot of assets that they need to bring in first. Then it's really very, you know, much going out and getting little pieces over time.
So is that why that load isn't as fast as everything else?
Exactly. You're bringing in all the big stuff first, and so those initial files are coming in and they're a lot bigger, but then those big files, they're doing everything. So they're creating all the functionality, they're set to go and grab little pieces, and so you're loading that interactivity, but then there's a lot more speed after that because it's just quick, lightning fast to go get little pieces of information rather than, again, the old days, every time you have to go back, you're getting these huge payloads. And so that's really the thing to think about when you're building an app now, is that you want to make sure, again, if you're hiring someone or if you're doing it internally, that you're thinking about these models, because the last thing you want to be doing is building a software that's outdated. And the next piece is really, what are some of the benefits of this new model? So speed, we already talked about. You get that initial load, but after that it's just very quick. Abstraction, and so the model separates. So the interesting thing about abstraction is, let's say we have this front-end interface that does all these things. It's much easier to change out a database and say, okay, well, we need a new structure. It's much easier to change out the processing, if you want to use a new coding language. And that front-end interface is a lot more, built out, that you've abstracted things separately from each other. And one of the things that you see now is the API interface, where really companies are building their own applications like an API, an application programming interface. So if you know that, you can connect to other softwares. This is basically, you build your software as an API, which helps you not only have the abstraction that other people can then connect to it, but then really your application is just connecting in that same way. Gets a little technical. User interface. So the one thing about going in this model where the interactive is up front is that the user experience is much better. It's quicker, not just with speed, but that you're getting these quick interactions. You're able to do a lot more, bring things in, just have a better user experience than, again, the old way of that, big payload back and forth. And then really flexibility of being able to have these different layers, that you can have a front-end developer that's working on your front-end code, and a back-end developer that's handling some of those pieces, and they can work separately from each other and really build, versus, again, the old payload days. Sometimes that stuff was really integrated, where the processing was actually creating the interface, and you needed those guys to really be hand in hand to do it. Now you can kind of separate that. So the model can play into a lot of interesting things for people.
For sure. What would you say to look for if you're looking to hire a developer, development team? What are some of the skill sets that you would say for the new model? What would be some of the
It depends what you have inside. I think that there's a whole different thing between planning an app. As we sit down and we're doing this with clients now, where you're really thinking about the database structure and making sure you understand how data has to relate to each other, what data is necessary, how you want to handle the functionality of information from a standpoint of if you want it to keep versions for record keeping and stuff. You really have to understand that strategy and that underpiece, as well as infrastructure, what's the coding and how's it built, and then you've got UI and what's the interface in that. And the question is, do you have some of that in-house, that if you've got that good strategy, infrastructure, data person, you can probably outsource a lot of the front end and some of the grunt stuff? Or do you have that and you really need to bring in a firm to help you with the side of planning out the app and making sure that you can truly understand how to build it? So it's not an easy answer.
Sure.
As far as what you're looking for, I think at the end of the day, there are a lot of, for me over the years, there's a clear distinction once you get to know it, of a very good developer that knows what they're doing and they're very good and they're very fast, and ones that kind of are mediocre and they haven't hit that point yet. And it's tough to see that if you don't know it. But if you're on the inside of understanding development, you can see very quickly which one works and which one doesn't. So it's interesting. And I think the last piece that we were going to talk about is really this Agile software development model. And we talked about this in a previous episode, but it's really about the process of building in chunks. Yeah. And so, again, going back to the old days of software development, you would have a year where you're building out new functionality for your next version. You would launch that CD maybe, or that download that would happen. Today, if you see Gmail, all of our softwares, they're updating on a regular basis. New features coming out, even things like Gmail where they have a labs and you can install little components that they test, and then once they like the component, maybe they install it into the base. So there's a lot of that where it's a lot quicker. And so the Agile model is really about, build a small piece, release it to the public, get some feedback, make decisions about what you build next, build that small piece, launch it, and it's a constant process so that you're pushing out updates, every other week, once a month, pretty fast versus every 6 months or a year.
So it seems like an obvious way to go, right? But I'm guessing it's just technical limitations that we had in the old days, that we had to build the one version, hope that everything worked, and then ship the disk, right, or however we're delivering it, and then we go improve it, and then, but now that we can do the delivery, the updates on the fly, it kind of changes everything. So
well, I think you have the technical limitations, and today the reason that you see that people potentially don't do this is either one, they don't know. There are still development shops out there that don't work in this way. The other is that you have a client or a product leader that wants to see big changes and big things done. And we see that a lot, is that a client will come in, they have this huge vision for the software and they can't imagine for a second releasing something that doesn't have all 50 features, rather than, it takes 8 months to put together all 50 features, but in a month and a half you can get 10 of them done, you can get it out there, then add the next 5 and next 5. It's about the same timing, but at least you're getting feedback, you're getting traction, all of these things, rather than just waiting. And I think that's a big barrier, is that mentality of some people that are building these, founders, whatever they might be, of wanting that big win, like, oh, I just launched.
They want everything, they want it perfect,
right,
out of the box.
Yeah, they want that big, just, we launched and here's all these things. And today that's just not how it should work. And if you're smart strategically, you shouldn't do that. You should really be launching little pieces. I'd want to launch something and start getting feedback from my users. Yes, I like that. No, I don't like that. Because what if, my roadmap really builds on feature B, and everybody, once they start using it, says, well, feature B is not that great, but man, I love feature A. And you go, wow, we have to shift. Would you have rather made that shift 8 months later after, you built 50 features, or would you rather have made that decision in 2 months early and figure it out? So that's the Agile model, is it gives you the ability to truly adapt to users' needs and wants so that you can build a better product that is more valuable.
And coming from a marketing perspective, I look at this, and this gets me excited because I think, wow, this gives me something to talk to the users about consistently, that we added something new, we added this, we listened to you, and we updated that. And that gets me excited, because as a marketer, you're always looking at ways to engage that user base, and if you have a bunch of updates on an ongoing basis, you always have something to talk about in that regard.
Yeah, it's perfect. So I think that's a good transition. Next week, we're going to be talking about the branding process. So, let's say we built the app, or now we've built an MVP. How do we start looking at the branding? And then after that, we're going to be talking about marketing. So how do you actually get it out there? And then I think our next series, that's going to be longer, is going to be all in depth about how do you do the marketing piece. So we're kind of moving this along up the pipe. But I think it should be a good next episode, talking about branding and what's that initial piece that you're getting out there with your MVP, and how do you kind of launch this thing.
Sounds good.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks everybody for coming and checking it out. Go check out our site, check out some of these past episodes. We've got a whole other series before this that was on brand strategy, maybe a great precursor for next week's episode. And we'll see you next week, and enjoy your hand sanitizer.
Stay well, everybody.
Bye.